All right. Right before I get into this article, I just want to say that this is one of my favorite articles from the Italian left, and I think it does a great job of illustrating its specifically ecological perspective. Long before these things are climate change and global warming are really even being taken seriously, it's specifically in response to the Polesine flood of November 1951, where the River Po basically flooded and submerged hundreds of hectares of agricultural land and killed 84 people and made hundreds of thousands homeless. And it wasn't like an unpreventable disaster. The levees were poorly maintained, and the river's slope was reduced by continuous deposits of detritus in the delta, and that led to an increased risk of storm surges. Experts had actually warned the Italian government beforehand of the risks, but it just didn't respond in time. Large investments would have been needed to improve the conditions along the Po's tributaries, and it would become dangerous due to high levels of erosion from the deforestation done. And the communist opposition's attempts to claim for human liability, they're deemed subversive by the Italian state, which also turned down applications for damages linked to the disasters, and instead it used this opportunity to begin anti-communist witch hunt instead of improving soil conditions. And all this is essentially a summary of a short article I found, which was about the flooding of the River Po, and I'll link it below in the video description, as well as the following text I'll be reading. So that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoy the audiobook. On the Thread of Time, published in Battaglia Comunista in 1951, article number 84, Murder of the Dead. In Italy, we have long experience of catastrophes that strike the country, and we also have a certain specialization in staging them. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, rainstorms, epidemics. The effects are indisputably felt especially by poorer people and those living at higher densities, and if cataclysms that are frequently much more terrifying strike all corners of the world, not always do such unfavorable social conditions coincide with geographical and geological ones. But every people and every country holds its own delights. Typhoons, drought, tidal waves, famine, heat waves, and frosts, all unknown to us in the Garden of Europe. And when one opens the newspaper, one inevitably finds more than one item, from the Philippines to the Andes, from the polar ice cap to the African desert. Our capitalism, as has been said 100 times over, is quantitatively small fry, but today it is in the vanguard, in a qualitative sense, of bourgeois civilization, of which it offers the greatest precursors from amidst Renaissance splendor, and the masterful development of an economy based on disasters. Who wouldn't dream of shedding a single tear if a monsoon washed away entire cities on the coast of the Indian Ocean, or if they were submerged by the tidal waves caused by submarine earthquakes? But we have found out how to collect alms all over the world for the Polesine. Our monarchy was great in knowing to not rush to the dance, pardonone, but to where the people are dying of cholera, Naples, or to the ruins of Reggio and Messina, razed to the ground by the earthquakes of 1908. Now our puffed-up president has been taken off to Sardinia, and if the Stalinists haven't been fibbing, they have shown him teams of Potemkin workers in action that then run to the other side of the stage like the warriors in Ida. It was too late to pull the homeless out of the flooding Po, but good play was made of MPs and ministers padding about in their wellies after setting up cameras and microphones for a worldwide broadcast of their lamentations. Here we have the bright idea. The state should intervene, and we have been applying it for a good 90 years. The professedly homeless Italian has set state aid in the place of the grace of God in the hand of Providence. He is convinced that the national budget has much wider bounds than the compassion of our Lord. A good Italian happily forks out 10,000 lira, squeezed out of him, so that months and months later he can squander 1,000 lira of the government's money. And during one of those periodic contingencies, now fashionably called emergencies, but which fall in all seasons, when the central government has scarcely initiated the unfailing provisions and fundings, a band of no less specialized homeless will roll up its sleeves and plunge into the business of procuring concessions in the orgy of contracts. The Minister of Finance of the day, Vanoni, suspends by his authority all other state functions and declares that he will not provide a single brass farthing from the exchequer for all other special acts, so that all means can be addressed to dealing with the present disaster. There could be no better proof than this, that the state services are for nothing, and if the hand of God really did exist, he would make a splendid present to the homeless of all kinds by causing earthquakes and bankrupting the charlatan and dilettante state. The foolishness of the small and middle bourgeoisie shines forth at its brightest when it seeks a remedy for the terror that freezes it in the warm hope of subsidy, and in indemnity liberally bestowed upon it by the government. But the reaction of the overseers of the working masses, who, they scream, lost everything in the disaster, but unfortunately not their chains, appear no less senseless. These leaders, who pretend to be Marxists, have for these supreme situations, which interrupt the well-being of the proletariat derived from normal capitalist exploitation, an economic formula even more foolish than that of state intervention. The formula is well known: make the rich pay. Vanoni is thus reviled because he was unable to identify and tax high incomes. But a mere crumb of Marxism suffices to establish that high incomes thrive where high levels of destruction occur, big business deals being based on them. The bourgeoisie must pay for war, stated those false shepherds in 1919, instead of inviting the proletariat to overthrow it. The Italian bourgeoisie is still here, and enthusiastically invests its income in paying for wars and other disasters, for which it is repaid fourfold. Yesterday. When a catastrophe destroys houses, fields, and factories during the active population out of work, it undoubtedly destroys wealth. But this cannot be remedied by the transfusion of wealth from elsewhere, as well as the miserable operation of rummaging around for old jumble, where the advertising, collection, and transport cost far more than the value of the worn-out clothes. The wealth that disappeared was that of past ages-old labor. To eliminate the effects of the catastrophe, a huge mass of present-day living labor is required. So, if we use a concrete social, not abstract definition of wealth, we can see it as the right of certain individuals who form the ruling class to draw on living contemporary labor. New incomes and new privileged wealth are formed in the immobilization of new labor, and the capitalist economy offers no means of shifting wealth accumulated elsewhere to plug the gap in Sardinian or Venetian wealth, just as one cannot take from the banks of Tiber to rebuild the ones swallowed up by the Po. This is why it is a stupid idea to tax the ownership of the fields, houses, and factories left intact to rebuild those affected. The center of capitalism is not the ownership of such investments, but a type of economy which allows the drawing and profiting from what men's labor creates in endless cycles, subordinating the employment of this labor to that withdrawal. Thus, the idea of solving a wartime housing crisis with an income freeze on landlords of undamaged houses led to the provision of homes in a worse condition than that caused by the bombing. But the demagogues shout easy arguments so as not to confuse the working masses. The basis of Marxist economic analysis is the distinction between dead and living labor. We do not define capitalism as the ownership of heaps of past crystallized labor, but as the right to extract from the living and active labor. This is why the present economy cannot lead to a good solution, realizing with the minimum expenditure of present labor the rational conservation of what past labor has transmitted to us, nor to the better basis for the performance of future labor. What is of interest to the bourgeois economy is the frenzy of contemporary work rhythm, and it favors the destruction of the still useful masses of past labor, not giving it a penny damn for its descendants. Marx explains that ancient economies, which are based more on use than exchange value, did not need to extort surplus labor as much as the present one, recalling the only exception, that of the extraction of gold and silver. It's not without reason that capitalism arose from money, where the worker was forced to work himself to death, as in Diodorus Siculus. The appetite for surplus labor not only leads extortion from the living of so much labor powers to shorten their lives, but does good business in the destruction of dead labor, so as to replace still useful products with other living labor. Like Marimaldo, capitalism, oppressor of the living, is the murderer also of the dead. Quote, but as soon as people whose production still moves within the lower forms of slave labor, corvée labor, etc., are drawn within the whirlpool of an international market dominated by the capitalist mode of production, the sale of their products for export becoming their principal interest, the civilized horrors of overwork are grafted on the barbaric horrors of slavery, serfdom, etc. End quote. The original title of the paragraph quoted is Der Heißhunger nach Arbeit, literally, the voracious appetite for surplus labor. Small-scale capitalism's hunger for surplus labor, as set out in our doctrine, already contains the entire analysis of the modern phase of capitalism that has grown enormously, the ravenous hunger for catastrophe and ruin. Far from being our discovery, to hell with the discoverers, especially when they sing the scale out of tune, then believe themselves to be creators. The distinction between dead and living labor lies in the fundamental distinction between constant and variable capital. All objects produced by labor which are not for immediate consumption, but are employed in the further work process, how one calls them producer goods, form constant capital. Quote, therefore, whenever products enter as means of production into new labor processes, they lose their character of being products and function only as objective factors contributing to living labor. End quote. This is true for main and subsidiary raw materials, machines, and other types of plant, which progressively wear out. The loss due to wear, which has to be compensated for, requires the capitalist to invest in another quota, always of constant capital, which current economics calls amortization. Depreciate rapidly. That is the supreme ideal of this grave-digging economy. We recalled, a propos, the body possessed by the devil, how, in Marx, capital has the demonical function of incorporating living labor into dead labor, which has become a thing. What joy that the Poes and Bakemans are not immortal, and today one can happily incorporate living labor into them. Projects and specifications are ready in a few days. Good boys, you are possessed by the devil. Quote, sir, the drawing offices of our firm has done the duty of predisposing technical and economic studies. Here they are all nice and ready. End quote. And price analysis values the stone of Montcelis higher than Carrara marble. Quote, the property, therefore, which labor power in action, living labor, possesses of preserving value, at the same time that it adds to it, is a gift of nature which costs the laborer nothing, but which is very advantageous to the capitalist inasmuch as it preserves the existing value of his capital. End quote. This value, which is simply preserved thanks to the operation of living labor, is called the constant part of capital, or constant capital by Marx. But, quote, that part of capital, represented by, invested in, labor power, wages, does, instead, in the process of production, undergo an alteration of value, and produces an excess, a surplus value. End quote. We therefore call it the variable part, or simply variable capital. The key lies here. Bourgeois economics calculates profit in relation to the constant capital, which lies still and doesn't move. In fact, it would go to the devil if the labor of the worker did not preserve it. Marxist economics, on the contrary, places profit in relation only to variable capital, and demonstrates how the active labor of the proletarian, A, preserves constant capital, dead labor, and B, increases variable capital, living labor. This increase, surplus value, is gained by the entrepreneur. This process, as Marx explains, of establishing the rate without taking into account constant capital is like making it equal to zero, an operation current in mathematical analysis where variable quantities are concerned. Once constant capital is set at zero, gigantic development of profit occurs. This is the same as saying that the enterprise's profit remains if the disadvantage of maintaining constant capital is removed from the capitalist's shoulder. This hypothesis is none other than state capitalism's present reality. Transferring capital to the state means that constant capital equals zero. Nothing of the relationship between entrepreneurs and workers is changed, since it depends solely on the magnitude of variable capital and surplus value. Are analyses of state capitalism something new? Without any haughtiness, we use what has been known since 1867 at the latest. It is very short. CC, that's constant capital, equals zero. Let us not leave Marx without this ardent passage after the cold formula. Quote, capital is dead labor, that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. End quote. Modern capital, which needs consumers as it needs to produce ever more, has a great interest in letting the products of dead labor fall into disuse as soon as possible, so as to impose their renewal with living labor, the only type from which it sucks profit. That is why it is in seventh heaven when war breaks out, and that is why it is so well trained for the practice of disasters. Car production in America is massive, but all, or nearly all, families have a car, so demand might be exhausted. So then it's better that the cars only last a short time, so that this is indeed the case. First, they are badly built with a series of botched parts. If the users break their necks more often, no matter, a client is lost, but there is a new car to substitute. Then they call on fashion, with a large cretinizing subsidy of advertising propaganda, through which everyone wants the latest model, like the women who are ashamed to put on a dress, even if it is perfectly good, from last year. The fools are taken in, and it does not matter that the Ford built in 1920 lasts longer than the brand new 1951 model. And finally, the dumped cars are not even used for scrap and are thrown into car cemeteries. Who dares to take the one saying, "You have thrown it away as if it were worthless. What harm is there in me fixing and reusing it?" It would get a kick up the backside and a jail sentence. To exploit living labor, capital must destroy dead labor, which is still useful. Loving to suck warm, young blood, it kills corpses. So, while the maintenance of the Po embankments for 10 kilometers requires living labor costing, let us say, $1 million a year, it suits capitalism better to rebuild them, all spending $1 billion. Otherwise, it would have to wait 1,000 years. This perhaps means that the nasty fascist government sabotaged the Po embankments? Certainly not. It means that no one has pressed for an annual budget of a miserable $1 million. This is not spent as it is swallowed up in the financing of other large-scale works of new construction, which have budget estimates of billions. Now the devil has swept away the embankments. One finds someone with the best motives of sacrosanct national interest who activates the project office and has them rebuilt. Who is to blame for preferring the large-scale projects? The fascists and official communists. Both of them prattle that they want a productivist full employment policy. Productivism, Mussolini's favorite creature, consists in establishing present-day cycles of living labor out of which big business and big speculation make billions. Let us modernize this aged machine of the great industrialists, and also let us modernize the riverbanks after letting them collapse at all the people's expense. The history of the recent years of administrative management of state works and of the protection of industry is full of these masterpieces, ranging from the provision of raw materials sold at below cost to works undertaken by a state monopoly in the struggle against unemployment on the basis that constant capital equals zero. In a few words, let us spend it all on wages, and since the enterprise has only shovels for equipment, the Lord is convinced that it is useful to shift earth first from here to there, and then immediately back to here again. If the Lord hesitates, the enterprise has the trade union organizer at hand. A demonstration of laborers shouldering shovels under the ministry's windows, and all's well. The discoverer arrives and supersedes Marx. Shovels, the only constant capital, have given birth to surplus value. Today, undoubtedly, the size of the disaster along the Po has been massive, and the estimated cost of the damage is still rising. Let us admit that the cultivated area of Italy lost 1,000 hectares, or 1,000 square kilometers, about 1/300th, or 3 per thousand of the total. 100,000 inhabitants had to leave the area, which is not the most densely settled in Italy, or, in round figures, 1/500th, or 2 per thousand. If bourgeois economy were not mad, one could do a simple little sum. The national stock has suffered a serious blow. However, the zone was only partially destroyed. When the floodwaters recede, the agricultural soil will largely be left behind, and the decomposition of vegetation along the decomposition of alluvium will partially compensate for the lost fertility. If the damage is 1/3 of total capital, it costs 1,000th of the national capital, but this has an average income of 5%, or 50 per thousand. If for a year every Italian saved scarcely 1/50th of his consumption, the damage would be made good. But bourgeois society is anything but cooperative, even if the freebooters of national capital escape Venoni by demonstrating that part ownership of their enterprises has been distributed among employees. All the productivistic operations of Italian and international economy are more or less as destructive as the Paduan disaster. The water entered through one hole and left through another. Such a problem is insuperable on capitalist grounds. If it were a question of making the arms to provide Eisenhower with his 100 divisions within a year, the solution would be found. They are all short-cycled operations, and capitalism is as pleased as punch if the order for the 10,000 guns is with a delivery date in 100 and not 1,000 days. The steel pool does not exist without reasons. But the part of hydrological and seismological organizations cannot be found, at least until the great science of the bourgeois period is really able to provoke series of floods and earthquakes, like aerial bombardments. Here it is a matter of slow, non-accelerable centuries-long transmission from generation to generation of the results of dead labor, but under the guardianship of the living, of their lives, and of their lesser sacrifice. Let us admit, for example, that the water in the Polocene will recede in a few months, and that the breach at Osebello is closed before the spring. Only one annual harvest cycle will now be lost. No productive investment can replace it, but the loss is reduced. If, instead, one believes that the Po embankments and those of the other rivers will frequently come apart, due as much as to the consequences of overlooked maintenance during 30 years of crisis as to the disastrous deforestation of the mountains, then the remedy will be even slower in coming. No capital will be invested for the good of our great-grandchildren. Our father wrote in vain that only a few examples of virgin forest remain, growing without the intervention of human labor. The forestry system thus becomes almost man's work, despite the minimum of capital in operation. Nevertheless, high-growing trees, the most important in the public economy, always require a very long period before yielding a useful product. However, forestry science has shown that the best year to fell lumber is not at the end of the maximum lifespan, but that in which the current growth equals average growth. One must always calculate 80, 100, or even 150 years for an oak wood. Di Vittorio and Pastor would fling the book, if they ever opened it, out the window. As in the operetta, steel. Capital cannot wait. There is still worse to relate. Relatively little is said of the disaster in Sardinia, Calabria, and Sicily. Here the geographical facts differ drastically. The very slight gradient of the Po value caused the buildup of water, which then swamped over the clay and impermeable soils below. The same reasons in the south and the islands of high rainfall and deforestation of the mountains with the steep fall down of the sea caused the destruction. The mountain streams washed sand and gravel from the bedrock and destroyed fields and houses, all in a few hours, without, however, causing many victims. Not only is the sacking of the magnificent forests of Aspremont and the Sila by the Allied liberators irreparable, but here also the renewal of land swamped by the floodwaters is practically impossible. Not merely uneconomic for the investors and for the helpers, more self-interested than the former, if that's even possible. Not only the narrow horizons of cultivatable soil, but also the thin, non-rocky strata that gave it weak support have been washed away. Soil which was carried up many times over the decades by the grindingly poor farmers. Every plantation, every tree, the basis of a rather profitable agriculture and industry in some villages, came down with the soil, and the orange and lemon trees floated out to sea. Replanting a destroyed vineyard takes them about 2 years, but citrus plantations only provide full harvest after 7 to 10 years, and a great amount of capital is needed to establish and run them. Naturally, the good books do not give the cost of the unthinkable operation of carrying up again for hundreds of meters the soil brought down, and, in any case, the water would carry it away before the plant roots could fix it to the subsoil. Not even the houses can be rebuilt where they were, for technical, not economic reasons. 5 or 6 unfortunate villages on the Ionian coast in the province of Ruggiero, Calabria, will not be rebuilt on their own hillsides, but down by the sea. In the Middle Ages, after devastation had caused the disappearance of every last trace of the magnificent coastal cities of Magna Graecia, the apex of agriculture and art in the ancient world, the poor agricultural population saved itself from the Saracen pirate raids by living in the villages built on the mountain tops, which are less accessible and thus more defensive. Roads and railways were built along the coast with the arrival of the Piedmontese government, and where malaria did not prohibit it, where the mountains ran down close to the sea, every village had its on-sea near the station. It became so convenient to carry timber away. Tomorrow, only the on-seas will remain, and there they are laboriously rebuilding some houses. So, what then? If the peasant reclimbs the slope where nothing can ever take root, and the very bare and friable rock strata itself does not permit the rebuilding of houses, and the workers by the sea, what will they do? Today, they can no longer emigrate like the Calabrians of the unhealthy lowlands, and the Lucanians of the damned claylands, made sterile by the greedy feeling of the woodland which once covered the mountain, and the trees that spread over the upland grazing. Certainly, in such conditions, no capital and no government will intervene, a total disgrace of the obscene hypocrisy with which national and international solidarity was praised. It is not a moral or sentimental fact that underlies this, but the contradiction between the convulsive dynamic of contemporary supercapitalism and the sound requirements for the organization of life of human groups on the earth, allowing them to transmit good living conditions through time. Bertrand Russell, the Nobel Prize winner, who quietly pontificates in the world press, accuses man of overly sacking natural resources, so much so that their exhaustion can already be calculated. Recognizing the fact that the great powers conduct absurd and mad policies, he denounces the aberrations of the individualist economy and tells the Irish joke. Why should they care about my descendants? What have they ever done for me? Russell counts among these aberrations, along with that of mystical fatalism, that of communism which states, if we have done with capitalism, the problem is solved. After such a display of physical, biological, and social science, he is unable to see that it is an equally physical fact that the huge level of loss of both natural and social resources is essentially linked up to a given type of production, and thinks that all would be resolved by a moral sermon, or a Fabian appeal to the human wisdom of all classes. The corollary is pitiful. Science becomes impotent when it has to solve the problems of the spirit. Those who really achieve human progress, taking decisive steps forward in the organization of human life, are not really the conquerors and dominators who still dare to ostentate greed for power, but the swarms of the insipid benefactors and proponents of the ERP and the brotherhood among peoples, like so many pacifist devacots. Passing from cosmology to economics, Russell criticizes the liberal illusions of the panacea of free competition and has to admit, quote, Marx predicted that free competition among capitalists would lead to monopoly, and that was proved correct when Rockefeller established a virtually monopolistic system for oil, end quote. Starting from this solar explosion, which one day will instantaneously transform us into gas, which could prove the Irishman right, Russell finishes with maudlin sentiments. Quote, nations desiring prosperity must seek collaboration more than competition, end quote. Is it not the case, Mr. Nobel Prize winner, who has written treatises on logic and the scientific method, that Marx calculated the development of monopoly 50 years earlier? If that was good dialectics, the opposite of competition is monopoly, not collaboration. Take good note that Marx also predicted the destruction of the capitalist economy, class monopoly, not with collaboration, with which you are devoted to flattering all the Trumans and Stalins of goodwill, but with class war. Just as Rockefeller came, Big Mustache must come, but not from the Kremlin. That one, despite Marx, is about to shave like an American.